we really do want to thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. And thanks for joining us today to talk about what we're calling the holy grail of all CX programs, tying your program back to financials, showing that true return on investment. More and more, if not nearly all of our clients are asking us how to answer questions around the ROI of their programs. So today we're going to share with you some of the tools we use, some of our thought processes on the subject, and some stories about how our clients are proving financial business value for their programs. Just as an FYI, logistically, this session is being recorded and all attendees will receive a copy of the recording. So if we can go to the next slide, introductions. Maybe should have done that first, but we'll do them quickly. My name is Jim Katzman. I'm one of our CX practitioners here at InMoment. I grew up on the client side as both an InMoment client and spent a long period of my time as a CX program owner. I was the global CX program leader for Assurant, cell phone insurance provider. Been in InMoment for just a couple weeks shy of 3 years and about 5 weeks behind my partner, Eric. So Eric, you want to do a mic check and introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the younger, better looking version of Jim. Hearing you not deny it, it must be true, right? Similar background to Jim's. Been a client for most of my career and led large-scale global VOC and CX programs, first in the high-tech space, and then more recently in the travel and hospitality space. And happy that all of you joined us here today.
Perfect. We can go to the next slide. So really quick agenda. InMoment, like many entities all over the place, have a series of frameworks that we use whenever we take on new client work or work with an existing client to, in this case, today's discussion, to make sure that those programs are driving a financial return. So after we do just a little bit of introduction about the state of ROI experience, we're going to leverage some of our stages of our success framework to share some ideas and examples to help you prove ROI for your programs. One other thing I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll either answer them on the fly or we'll answer them at the end of the program. Our goal is to wrap in about 50 minutes. We like to give people a chance to stretch before what is probably their next meeting. So if we can go to the next slide. One of the things we decided to do differently today is we want to make this interactive, even though this is a webinar format. So we have a few polls throughout the presentation. We want you to join the conversation. We want you to really think when we put these questions to be intellectually honest. We're not scoring. We don't have your identity. We want you to be honest because we think it will help generate the discussion that we want to discuss. So take the polls when they come up. Kirsten, we can go to the next slide. So the text at the top of this slide sort of tells it all. More than ever, companies are looking at how they look at their spend for anything that appears anything even remotely discretionary. And unfortunately, CX programs can fall into that bucket if you're not continuously showing business value. In fact, if you look on the right side of this chart, in this study, 30% of the respondents to this study cited some sort of financial related challenge to sustaining their CX investment. So the reality is that there's just tons of pressure on business. So moving to the left side of the chart, we'll show 3 of them here. So first, you may have heard the term the year of the squeeze. And basically the squeeze is being driven by flat or slowly rising wages and increased inflation. This causes economic pressure, making folks question those discretionary spend. A second pressure is around employees, the great resignation, the great rotation. Call it what you want, employee issues are taking mindshare for a lot of companies. And more recently, we're actually starting to see layoffs now in the news, when just a few months ago, all of the news stories and all of our friend stories and all of our LinkedIn post stories were around people leaving, getting 20 to 30% increases, getting promoted, et cetera. Now the tide seems to be turning a little bit. So employee retention is a big driver for businesses. And then just the general business environment. A lot of companies out there reinventing, refining, redesigning, choose your adjective there. And they're thinking about, as they do these big changes in their business, where does CX fit? And we argue that it fits extremely front and center, but we just need to make sure that with all of the different challenges of businesses fighting for resources, that the CX program doesn't get lost in the shuffle. So go to the next question and we'll launch our first poll. Once again, be intellectually honest. How well do you believe your program ties its efforts back to a financial return on investment? We're going to give people about 25 seconds to answer. 10 more seconds. Hopefully people are thinking, but not thinking,
Thought you were going to play the Jeopardy theme, Gene.
probably should have brought some music into this. All right, I think we're good. So if we can show the results. All right, so Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm not actually terribly surprised. I think, as you said in the intro, this is something lots of companies are struggling with. This is something that we're seeing the industry talk about quite a bit. You and I know it from our clients asking, and so glad to see A, that people are probably being intellectually honest as you requested, and B, glad they joined us here today, and hopefully we can give them some hints and tips and tricks on how to solve this situation.
I agree. Yeah, my personal over/under was that we'd be, above 50% showing some value, and we were just slightly below. Those bottom two boxes were at 55%. All right. Well, with that, let's start talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to start simple here. I think a lot of times when people talk about, oh, how do I measure ROI? They boil the ocean. They make it really hard. When we think about how can you demonstrate an ROI from your CX program, we really boil it down to four things that your C-suite executives care about. Is it helping you get new customers? Is it helping you keep more of the customers that you have today, or reducing churn and plugging the proverbial leaky bucket that so many companies have? Is it for those customers that you keep, is it helping you keep them longer? Is it helping you sell more products to them or services to them and cross-selling and upsell so that you're really driving increases in lifetime value? And then fourth, are you driving insights and are you driving actions that are helping you serve the customer or even sell to the customer more efficiently? So driving down your cost to sell or cost to serve. So what you'll see as we go through here today is really trying to tie it back to one of these four things, because this is what your executives care about. Next slide. Here's the whammy, and it may tie back to the poll, right? Surveys don't deliver ROI. Surveys probably aren't even the best, well, not even probably. Surveys aren't the best way to even measure your ROI. Now, that said, everybody's freaking out and saying, oh my God, he works for InMoment, and I can't believe they said that. If you think about building financial models and help me understand how my internal metrics link to my transactional studies, and my transactional studies link to key drivers in my relationship study, and how do those relationship studies link to business outcomes, all good work to be done, all very smart way to help inform your business, honestly. But they're not going to help you measure ROI, right? What they're going to do, what that model is going to help you do is really determine or give you the roadmap on what you should work on or what's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck. But it won't give you the answer at the other end about ROI. And that's what we're going to talk about here for the next half an hour or so. Thanks, Kirsten. So on the right here, what you see is the continuous improvement framework that InMoment uses with our clients. And it's really thinking about how do you start with the end in mind? And you're going to hear Jim and I say that a few times over the next half an hour, but start with the end in mind. You're trying to drive an ROI-focused program, right? So how do you get there? How do you work backwards? How do you think about how am I going to design my program, both my listening program as well as my CX program, to get to that end in mind? So many of our clients, so many of the CX programs that you see out there are really stuck in these gray stages. We've got good listening going on and we're doing a lot of analysis, probably analysis paralysis is going on, but too many programs get stuck in those stages. And so it's really about how do we take those insights that we're creating and driving action, driving transformation in our company that will yield an ROI that we can take back to the C-level executives and say, look, here's what we've done, here's the actions we've taken, here's the outputs that we've given you. So we're going to spend the rest of the time today kind of ignoring the gray bars here and really focus in on design, transformation, and realizing an ROI. Time for our next poll.
So when you launched your current customer experience program, did you focus on surveys first? Actually going to give people a few more seconds
I think this one will be the true test of intellectual honesty, Jim.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. So just you think that 30 seconds is a really long time until you try not to talk for 30 seconds. So I feel like we probably do need, music or a magic trick, but hopefully this is one that people can sort of react to. I think
I
Alex
heard
will
you've been working on a song and dance routine. Maybe you can break that up.
you just never know. So Alex, I think we're going to the poll. Okay, so actually I am a little surprised by this. I thought we'd actually be north of 80% for people that had started with CX programs. So part of me is encouraged that people did sort of think about more holistic trends and things. Glad that we have 10% of our audience that is just here to learn as much as they can from us. We're always excited to share there as well. Eric, anything jump out at you?
But no, that was the part that surprised me, is the 10% there that honestly, I think you've got the best opportunity here. Because if you don't have a CX program today, hopefully you can use some of the tips and tricks that we're talking about here and really think about that design that Jim's going to talk about on the next page, to really design this with ROI in mind as you build your CX program. So
excellent.
Back
All
to
right.
you.
So we go to the next slide. So let's talk about design. When I'm sharing with this, if you think of the framework that Eric showed, this is high noon. This 12 o'clock, and really, what our thought on design and the reason that it's part of our framework is that if you get this wrong, it makes proving ROI even harder, because one of two things are going to happen. You're either going to get no actionable insights, nothing that you can act on to go to those other stages that we're going to talk about, or you get false signals. You get things that are not important or that don't drive to a financial pillar. And that's equally as bad, because then you sort of either get complacent or you miss the opportunity. And so we really do spend time, and I'm sure that you see a theme. I'm not going to go through all these bullets, but I'm sure you see a theme in the last 3 bullets. One of the biggest challenges that we InMoment face as we talk to clients is the obsession with scores. Whether it's the comfort level with years of trends, whether it's something more complex like, oh, our scores are tied to compensation, many clients are very weary to change a program if it's going to affect their scores. And this is a killer to driving ROI. So I personally believe, and once again, we work for InMoment, I personally believe that scores don't drive dollars. So before all the data scientists out there start attacking me, I'm not saying there's not correlation between scores and CX drivers. There are. But business changes, the things I talked about very early on in the presentation, things like that, something that correlated strongly last year may be totally different. Something that correlated strongly last quarter may be very different and may not be as big of a financial driver now. So scores can be great rallying cries. We are a score obsessed world, so we definitely like to keep score. But in the design phase, we really need to build a program that allows us to capture insights that focus on the end in mind. So that's, for those of you like scoring at home or making this a drinking game, that's the second time that we've said design with the end in mind. This will allow us, to capture the insights that we can turn into actions that become a financial return. So if you can go to the next slide, I want to share. Go ahead, Eric.
Jim, let me add one thing to this.
Sure.
Because I think you hit the right thing. Don't be stuck on scores. But the other point here, I think, in the last 3 bullets is make sure your program reflects today's business or the business that you want to have tomorrow. Make sure you're not stuck in a tracking study that was designed 5+ years ago and is reflecting that business, because as we all know, the world has changed completely in the last 3 years. So make sure your program is reflecting today and tomorrow and not yesterday.
Awesome. All right, so I want to share an example of successful designs. I work with a health insurance provider who had actually abandoned their CX program for lots of different reasons. But when we started working with them, they had 2 very clear objectives. Number 1, they wanted to resume measuring. They wanted to start listening. Number 2, they wanted to make sure that they started to drive a culture around member experience, around putting their members first. So when we launched the program, we launched it with just 2 listening posts. A post-call survey after members called, and a post-claim survey after they filed a claim, either on the web or on the app. And then in addition to that, they created an inner and outer loop process. So they called back customers that were unhappy, and they engaged their employees in outer loop activities to actually bring them together and start to share and understand the points of friction that were being identified in their brand new listening program. So I'm going to leave the story here because this, the design part is what they did really well. I'll come back to this when we get to realize in the next section. And with that, we have poll question number 3. So if you were in an elevator with an executive from your company, would you be able to give an example of an insight-based action that you've taken? So we're really going to start to transition the discussion from environment and design to how do we start moving into transform. So if you were in an elevator with an executive, would you be able to give a concrete example of an insight-based action that you've taken? I'm going to give people a few seconds to really think about this. Just a couple more seconds.
Do, 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 do.
All righty.
Right about where I expected it, Jim. I think you and I made a bet before this and said, hey, where would this end up? And I said probably 60 or just above 60. So.
You said 60. I have our cheat notes to prove it. You said 60. So okay. Fantastic. All right.
Yeah,
So
I love the people who said, what's an elevator? And in this work from home environment, if you have an elevator in your house, I want to be working from your house.
That's true. All right, so let's dig into transform.
All right, so as you remember from earlier when we showed the framework, transform is really where you get out of research mode or voice of the customer mode and really say, okay, we've done all this work, we've generated great insights, as the poll question suggests. What do we do about it? How are we going to take action on it? And what we've found is there's really 3 elements of success here as you work towards transformation. 1, how are you organized around taking action, and how are you coordinating that across the company? And a lot of times we'll talk about that as governance, or what's your governance model. 2 is action planning, and how are you managing the closed loop processes, both the inner loop and the outer loop that we'll talk about in a minute. And the 3rd is really portfolio management, because if you think about this, you don't just have one project going on at any given time. You have a whole portfolio of projects. And so how do you manage those? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. Next slide, please, Kirsten. So a little bit of a busy slide here, but giving you an example of how this organizing for success or a governance model might work. And I'm going to start with the green bar in the middle there, CX Council. You can call it whatever you want, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to call it a CX Council. This is really about how do you get how do you create a multifunctional or cross-silo team that owns and drives all aspects of the CX program. So rather than living in the silos that most American businesses, in fact, most global businesses live in, where the call center is working on their things and operations is working on their things and sales and marketing are working on their things, get that team together and really look at a journey-based approach and say, okay, how are we going to work end to end? How are we going to cooperate? Because the customer doesn't care that you sit in operations or you sit in sales. The customer wants a better experience. And so that's really the heart of this. But where we've seen it be extremely successful is, where are the ladders or where are the connections to your C-suite, your executive leadership team, or your CEO? And then more importantly, as this council makes decisions and drives actions or prescribes actions, who are the champions out there in the organization that make sure that this lives on a daily basis? Who are the working groups that they assign to tackle some of these things? And how do you engage your front line? Because if we're real, in most businesses, the front line is really the one that interacts with the customer and delivers your experience. So it can't just be these people in the middle. There has to be tentacles working throughout the organization, both upward and downward organizationally. And we'll give you an example of that here in a minute. Next slide, Kirsten. Inner loop and outer loop. Hopefully, most of you are familiar, hopefully all of you are familiar with the Net Promoter System and that terminology of inner loop and outer loop. The inner loop is really about one-to-one learning and action. So how do you take feedback from a customer and act on it to solve their issue or address their needs and feedback? So, you know, that inner loop is really one-to-one. It's often very frontline driven within your organization, but it's extremely, I mean, just critically important. We have a lot of data that we could share with you at another time that shows the power and the importance of having an effective inner closed loop system, both in terms of, for those of you who are always asking me, how do I boost my response rates? Here's how you do it. But you not only boost response rates, you drive sales, you reduce churn, and you drive recommendations. So if you want ROI, have an effective closed loop process. Jim, I see you jumping off a minute.
I was just going to say, I was just going to jump off and say, if you don't need an example of ROI, there it is. You know, just getting those customers to keep talking to you and keep sharing ideas. They will spend more. They will stay longer. It drives retention. It is financial. That was it. You were good.
Amen. Thank you. Outer loop is really. Well, hang on. Go back, Kirsten, please. The outer loop is really. Now we're really getting haywire. There we go. The outer loop is really the work that CX Council on the previous page does, right? This is digging into the root cause. This is understanding why things are happening in the organization, what's really causing them. How do we prioritize some of these things? What are the strategic investments that we want to make, or the structural things that we want to fix in the company? So here's where you need that cross-functional governance. Here's where you need enough political clout in your organization to say, hey, we can get these things done collectively. We have the people, we have the budget and the resources. So it's kind of that yin and yang of fixing one-to-one issues in the inner loop and fixing one-to-many issues in the outer loop. And then the most important piece there, communicating that back to customers. I think a lot of companies are trying with the outer loop, but what you don't see is, hey, we heard you, we listened, we took this action. Here, come see the new experience. All right, next page. And then finally, I mentioned talking about portfolio management, right? There's always low-hanging fruit to tackle. There's easy projects that you can get done in, you know, a day or a week on the website, or 30 days somewhere in the organization. So you're always going to have this mix of short-term and long-term projects that you're addressing. And so how do you manage that portfolio? How do you vet these things and say, hey, yes, this is worth chasing and that's not worth chasing? I boiled it down here to this Rubik's Cube and really kind of 3 dimensions. How many customers are going to be impacted by this if we make a change? What's the cost benefit of doing this? Obviously, it's going to cost us money in a lot of cases to make this change, but what do we think the return is? Either back to those 4 pillars again, new customers, you know, reducing churn, or adding value or reducing cost. And third, how easy is it to implement? Obviously, the holy grail is the things that are really easy to do, have a great ROI, and touch all of our customers. Fantastic. Yeah, go do those, right? And some of those, you know, may exist in the digital world, but some of these things take IT investment. They might take 18 to 24 months to get done. And so really managing those things against your portfolio of other projects as well, and making sure that you've got, you know, Jim will say this in a minute, but making sure you've got things that are hitting singles all the time, and giving you, you know, giving you visibility to say, hey, we are fixing things and we are making a difference in pushing this forward.
Well,
So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you for a good story here.
Yeah, before you go off this slide, Kirsten, you know, I think this slide also gets back to design. So if you've designed your program thoughtfully, ideally you'll be able to understand and hear within the signals, within the listening, those initiatives that you should focus on based on number of customers impacted, cost to deploy, and results. So I think it starts to create, the reason our success framework is a circle is this starts to complete that circle. So if we go to the next slide, I want to share a little bit about one of our clients, Reliant Energy. So Reliant Energy has taken a combination of all of the things to heart, whether it's the governance discussion, the prioritization discussion. Their president chairs what they call a customer first council. And their customer first council meets monthly to review a lot of the key customer metrics across all of their entities. They look at existing projects, they plan upcoming initiatives, and they have customer champions all across the company. And each one of those departments, they've gone and they've tried to find those customer fanatics. Every one of us that works with company knows who I'm talking about. There's some people that come into work every day and execute. There's some people that come in every day and maybe don't. And then there's some people that come every day that are just like so half full, it drives everyone else crazy. Well, that's who we want to try to find to move our customer experience program. And so those fanatics, those department representatives and champions are accountable for some of that success. And they're coordinated by a centralized team so they can actually bring things together, share those best practices across the country, across the company. And they do workshops and e-learning modules, et cetera. I work with one of the units in Reliant, and we do a call with their contact center folks, every 45 days. And we spend time really digging in and having really thoughtful discussion around what's driving customer satisfaction, where are the opportunities to learn, what are the things we should be doing better, what, bringing in some operational data, what centers are newer and how are their new agents doing. And it's just this obsession and focus with governance and sponsorship at the executive level that's really allowed them to go from just measuring and listening to actually taking action and doing. So really cool story. Which brings us to our last poll question. If a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, did it make a sound? I want you to really think hard about this one, because this is important. That's why it's in here. Really important, really relevant to our topic.
And yes, you did join the right webinar, so. We good?
Well, hopefully everyone's having this philosophical discussion in their mind. Alex, I think we can go ahead and close this one. All right, Eric, I got nothing. I know we put this in here, so you tell me, is there some learning in here?
You're like our audience. You're wondering why the heck this question is in the middle of it. Well, the reason this is in here is our next topic really is around that realize stage, and how do you not only demonstrate the ROI, but how do you communicate that and how do you share that? And so that's really why this question is important, because it says, hey, if it didn't happen or nobody was around to see it happen and you didn't share it, does it actually count? And so it, as we tee off this next section, it's really about, okay, go measure that ROI, but share it throughout the organization and celebrate the wins as well.
Now that question makes perfect sense. Awesome. I will take that to the lead. So at this point, we've shown how important it is to design with those business goals in mind, front and center. We've talked about the different tools and mechanisms between governance and prioritization of how to actually, choose the things to work on. Now it's time to measure success. We call this realize. And we have a few tips for you to consider here. It is critical to engage some finance organization. They're the ones that know how to count. It could be a departmental finance team. So if you're working, I do a lot of work with call centers. It could be the folks that are in that call center, responsible for adherence and efficiency. It could be, any other finance team, but they're the ones that can help you quantify wins. I think the two biggest mistakes that CX program owners make, and I probably did this myself initially, is overthinking the calculation of return and feeling like you have to show millions and millions of dollars in order to get noticed. So as Eric said, and I don't know how clearly everyone can see things in my office, I am quite the baseball fan. To me, CX is a game of base hits and sacrifice flies. If you're looking at operational cost as your proof point, use your customer insights to deflect just 1% of your calls into a call center. If you're using, if you're looking at basket size or abandonment in a retail environment, aim to get a 3% less abandonment rate in your retail basket. Those add up, and that's really what we drive. And as Eric said, and the reason that we did ask archery in the forest question, you have to be vocal. You have to share the wins. This is not the time to be bashful. This is the time to almost be boastful. Share them far and wide. Be sure to say, hey, you know what? We accomplished X because of our CX investment. So if we can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
This next
And
slide
Jim,
is,
Jim,
go ahead,
just let
Eric.
me-
Absolutely. Jump in.
Yeah, sorry. I mean,
No, you're good.
to your point about here's where you can most, but here's where you have to have your finance team involved, right? You want them backing you up saying, yes, indeed, they did drive this change. Yes, indeed, they did save this money or reduce this churn. The other value with the finance team is, look, if you've worked in a big company, we all double count. Hey, I saved that. No, I saved that. Hey, suddenly we've saved 3x the people that are even our customers, right? And so partnering with finance also kind of reduces the double counting issue.
Awesome, Ed. So if you go to the next slide. So we had a question in the chat, along with the design and end in mind theme. Can you give some examples of ends that you've seen companies designing for, and assuming the end is not an increase in scores? So as you can see on this slide, we've given a fair amount of ends in mind that are not score related, that are all financial related. So I'm going to let people digest. We're definitely not going to go grid by grid, but when we really thought about this to sort of bring this together and really start thinking about, how do we calculate, this aligns exactly with the pillars that Eric discussed earlier: getting new customers, keeping the ones we have, growing lifetime value, driving down costs. Almost every activity we do can fit into one of those buckets. And what we've given here is a sample of the types of metrics that either we see clients using today or we've used in our past. I come from an area where my program was very operationally focused. We looked a lot at things like call deflection and completion, completion of claims on the web. We looked at first call resolution. Like, we honed in on if we had customers that gave us insights as to what we could do different to make it easier, and we could then implement that through that transform phase and then measure it in very small wins, 1% here, 2% here. That gave us the opportunity. We look a lot with our retail clients at retention and likely to return. A customer that has a great experience digitally, they get their product on time, they're going to come back sooner. And being able to measure that and hear in the customer voice and other data sources that we can bring in from social listening and employee listening, et cetera, to really understand what makes those things stick. That's when you get the tools to be able to allow us to start really calculating in terms of dollars how people are spending their money with us or how we're saving money delivering the service. Eric, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I think it ties back to that slide I had 20 minutes ago that said surveys aren't going to help you define your ROI. Here's where it is, right? It's here. It's also partnering with your internal business partners. What are the metrics they're tracking every day? What are the things they're being held accountable for? It's probably some of the things on this list or others that you can dream up. And so, it's about getting into your data warehouse and looking at, all right, what are we really changing here?
Eric, I think you have our first story.
Yeah, I've got a simple one here for you. And back to Jim's point about don't boil the ocean. Don't boil the ocean, and be very conservative in your estimates as you build your business cases. So this goes back to, I told you I led CX in the travel and hospitality industry previously. So this was a business case we built to make effectively $1 million investment. We said, let's be conservative. What if we can save, and back to our closed loop process conversation earlier, what if I can save one customer a month? Just one. 12 times a year. So I'm going to save 12 customers. But I worked in a company that had 10,000 locations. So let's say I can do it one a month in each of our top 1,000 locations. Now, understand our biggest location had 4 million customers a month. So if I could just get one of those every month, that location probably could have covered some of the other top 1,000. Now I'm at 12,000 customers. Now, I've blinded some of this data for you, obviously, but let's say the average customer value is $210 per customer. Not huge spend, but suddenly now by saving one customer a month at 1,000 locations, I've just saved the company $2.5 million. And that's just on that pure dollars, right? That doesn't include how long did they stay? That doesn't include did they buy more after this? So I'm not even factoring in what improvements in lifetime value there may be. just on this alone, $2.5 million for $1 million investment. And Jim, I know you love this story, so I'll let you close it out.
Yeah, so I want to come back to my health insurance client. So how have they realized? How have they done this? So as just to refresh your memory from 25 minutes ago, brand new program, started very simple, a couple listening posts, some inner and outer loop. So early in the program, they were hearing from customers and employees that there were certain claim types that might be a good fit for what they called their real-time or automatic adjudication, their automatic approval process. So our client took action and really honed in on a specific type that the members were really complaining about to move to their real-time approval process. And they did it. The results were great, and they were great on 3 fronts. Number one, real-time claim of throughput increased by 10%. So that means that no one had to touch those claims. So that reduced call volume, which was quantifiable. It reduced claim handling by a manual claim agent, which was quantifiable. They truly showed real dollars without having to get braggadocious. They just did the math. There's my SAT word for the day, braggadocious. Number 2, members were happy. So their scores improved, which is kind of cool. But more importantly, the members that had these recurring claims felt relief because now they could just be more efficient. And then third, and we haven't spent a lot of time on this topic today because we've been talking about dollars, but I'm really into the culture side of CX. Their employees were engaged because their employees were part of the process. And so when their employees became part of the process, they started to get energized, and they really started to move toward, if you recall what I talked about, their second objective was to get everyone on board around a members first culture. So true success story. And now what's happened 2.5 years later is we're expanding the program. We're doing more listening posts. They're getting more people engaged. They're using they're democratizing the data to other teams within their organization. They've really truly created a program that's proved financial value and has given them the opportunity to expand. Which leads us to our last point of the day. So for those of you that are pop culture stars, I'm not going to sing, but Jessie J, famous pop star Jessie J has said, it's not about the money. It's also about culture. Maybe she didn't say it's about culture, but we are. So, here's the thing. We've talked a lot about ROI in financial terms throughout the day. And we want to make sure that we do think about this as a cultural journey as well. This is about driving thought process and mind share in addition to driving dollars. And that's why we talk about sharing data. And as you get those wins for the program, share them, celebrate them, obviously quantify them. I mean, that's been our topic of the day, but move your program into what we're calling it InMoment, a culture of commitment to CX across your business. We want to get to the point that the program is generating wins, ideally financially, but also culturally, so that the folks that work in invoicing and accounting feel just as connected to the customer as that frontline rep that may be talking to someone on the phone. Eric, I know you're going to break into a verse here of Jessie J, but anything else to add?
Yeah, I think she got it wrong. It's all about the money. So.
All right, so that completes our prepared comments. We're right on schedule to wrap up. We do have some questions. Please continue to put them in the chat. I want to go back. Someone asked, what advice do you have for those in a utility with a monopolistic attitude towards customers? How do you convince the C-suite to invest in CX programs? So Eric may have some thoughts on this, but I'll give you my thought. My thought is that even in a monopoly environment, there's regulators, and there's regulators that get complaints from customers all the time. And I can either spend my time and resources dealing with complaints, backpedaling around it, et cetera, or I can use the customer insight to actually make those friction points go away. And now I've actually saved money from a regulatory response perspective. So even if I don't have a choice, even if as an end user, I don't have a choice where I get my electricity, I still want it to be a great experience. And I still want people to feel like it's friction-free to deal with me. So there are absolutely financial value even in dealing in monopolies. That's my perspective coming from an insurance environment. Eric, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, you gave the Reliance example earlier, and obviously some markets they're deregulated, some markets they're regulated, but we work with other utilities that are in regulated or monopolistic situations. And, if you think back to the four pillars, pillows. I need a nap apparently. Acquiring customers, retaining customers, you don't have to worry about that in your situation, right? People move into your territory or move out of your territory, but they're stuck. But the other two are very relevant to you. You know, every utility I've ever met is always trying to sell you, hey, let me protect the electrical lines in your house. Let me, you know, make sure you've got a clean water filter or whatever else. So there's always the ability to, you know, sell additional products and services above and beyond the utility service. And then to Jim's point, there's obviously ways you can save money, which always helps you with your rate cases. But, you know, and I think there's the third is higher customer satisfaction. The fewer complaints that your state department is getting about the utility helps you with your rate cases as well. So, you know, it's not about acquisition and retention, but it's more about what additional revenue could we get out of them? What cost savings can we get out of them? And how can we make our rate cases easier because we've got satisfied customers?
Excellent. All right, Eric, I'm going to read this one. Can you speak to how organizations can deal with a situation of a centralized CX entity implementing correct NPS inner and outer loop council activities, but existing outside of the business unit and perhaps at arm's length from the functional realities of the business? How have companies bridged this gap in order to have central direction over activities that the business unit can still own?
Yeah, I love that question, but I think it feeds right back to that CX council example that we gave around organization and governance. Right, the CX team. Here's where I think they could be a little bit more successful. Include those BUs in your council. So it's not the central CX team sitting up in corporate dictating what people are doing. Join hands with your BU leaders. Join hands with the people who own your digital channels. Join hands with your leaders of operations. Join hands with the heads of the call centers or whatever it may be in your business, and make this a peer-driven council and not the corporate hammer that says thou shalt. I think to me that's where I've seen the most success is when that CX team is seen as a peer and a partner to the organization and not a corporate entity that's imposing things. Because I think we all know the answer of, hey, what happens when you say I'm from corporate and I'm here to help.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I was part of a centralized CX team, so I didn't know all the inner workings of the divisions and departments that were using the data that we were collecting. So it behooved me to learn more and get engaged with them to help them, tell the right stories. We didn't even talk about that today. We could do a whole webinar on the storytelling power of CX, but being able to tell stories and get that corporate company mind share, you do that in concert. And when you do that in concert, the BUs will be coming to the centralized CX team because they'll be able to help them get things rolling. So we have a lot of questions. I'm going to move on a little bit more. So is an increase in WTR considered a retention metric? And we think, given all the different acronyms in the world, that WTR is willingness to return, or I'm assuming this is a retail question. So we're going to take that and say, is an increase of retention metric? I would say absolutely. Repeat purchases is absolutely retention. So
I'm going to argue completely 180 degrees opposite of each.
I love this.
Because I think, to me, this goes back to survey metrics versus business metrics. Willingness to return, willingness to recommend, whatever this WTR stands for, that's a survey-based metric. You're asking somebody how willing they are to do something. Let's look at their actual behavior. Let's tie this to a real behavioral metric. Did they come back? Did they spend more? So, I'm going to disagree with you there. I think it's an interim metric to an outcome metric. It's
very healthy to disagree. I'm good with it. I'm totally good with it. And we may be wrong on what this attendee wanted. So if we have the wrong metrics, send us to us and we'll disagree on another answer for you. We'd be happy to do that. So our next question is, how many of the metric examples, I guess, that we slided on the earlier slide with the grid, would you call transactional metrics, something that could be tracked in real time? What are the pitfalls of defining transactional metrics?
So I think the first part of this is easier to answer. I think most of them, well, most of them should be able to be tracked in real time. I think, lots of big companies have all kinds of data silo issues and tech debt and legacy systems that prevent it. But a lot of those you should be able to measure those in real time. And so, I think in terms of pitfalls, look, everything has pitfalls to it, but if somebody in your organization is using that metric, and you can prove that there's a linkage between that metric and future customer behaviors or positive business outcomes tied back to one of those four pillars, then I say go for it, right? I mean, look, every metric, especially in big companies, nothing's pure, right? It's really difficult to get a pure metric that doesn't have some flaws in how it's measured or some, assumptions that are being made when that's measured. That's okay. As long as you're consistent in, hey, we know this flaw exists, but it's the best we have today until you can work to close those gaps. As long as you're consistent with your usage of it and you recognize what the flaws or the gaps in the measurement are, I think, yeah, it's still better than nothing.
We have a bunch more questions. So the next one, I'm not sure which of our internal InMoment employees that are on the call we owe thanks for this question, but we'll take it. How should I leverage my vendor, my customer experience vendor, to help me leverage my plan to get more investment, i.e. the cost of new AI features or some enhancement that will help drive call deflection or IVR technologies? Maybe this is call center software vendor. Maybe it's not. It is probably
yeah,
call center.
CSAS is a call center vendor.
Call center vendor. Okay, so it's not something. How should I leverage them to help me leverage my plan? So let me think. So I'll think on the fly for a second. We are really spending a lot of time as we work with large call center organizations, looking at conversations, and being able to bring in, instead of just a survey, bring in the conversation of the conversation in contact center into our InMoment environment as another data source. And so what that allows you to do is to basically start to amplify signals that people are talking about. So I think that the answer here is you can do it a couple of ways. You could work with them, or if you are working, I don't know. This is a tough one. I'm a little struggling with how to answer this one on the fly. Eric, you have any thoughts?
No, you're our call center expert. So
yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, there's so many companies now that do SaaS work, have the ability to bring in different data sources and make sense and noise them. We've invested heavily in this, so we think we do it really well. I think you could go about it a couple of different ways. I think that the long and short of it is you should do something. You shouldn't let those conversations just sit out there and be only used for quality assurance for your reps. You should absolutely be harnessing learnings from them to drive initiatives that could become ROI.
Yeah. And I'd say, look, let's capture that question, and you and I can give it some thought and hopefully come back with a better answer.
Yeah. Eric, I don't know if you've looked through to see some of the other questions, if you want to jump into one.
Yeah, I've seen a few here and some that I think we can tick off pretty quickly. So a follow-up to the slide on the metrics to prove ROI. Are your thoughts there that these are measures that are quantified before the initiative versus after? And I would say both, right? I mean, in order to prove a change, in order to prove an ROI, you have to have the baseline before you tested something, before you implemented a change, and then be able to measure it after. I think the reason we included all of those metrics on that slide were there are things that your business, and depending on what type of business you are, of course, should be able to measure. Yes, I acknowledge tech debt and data silos and all the other problems big companies have. I've lived that and suffered with that myself in my career, but get as close to it as you're able to measure, but you should be able to have a baseline before putting initiatives in place and then measuring the change afterward. That's really how you're going to get to measuring an ROI.
Perfect. I want to jump to the culture question. So what, if any, suggestions could you offer for changing a company culture so that team members care about being part of a CX program, wanting to put the customers first? This seems very hard to achieve. So I love this question because I think the best way to do it is to get every employee as close to the customer as you can. So, if you have an opportunity to share call center interactions, if you have an opportunity to go to the field, if you have an opportunity to spend time, at a counter of a customer service, of a travel or hospitality, if you get people living the life of their customer, walking in their shoes, they will have a newfound appreciation for the challenges and opportunities that come with it, and they'll be hungry to be part of it. I think the second thing is celebrating successes. Hey, look, we did something based on the voice of the customer, and we've introduced a new product and it's doing great. We changed processes and we've made it easier to do business. I think it all goes back to how you socialize and how you get people to feel like everything they do. It's back to what I said a few minutes ago. You want our payroll clerk to feel as connected to the customer as the frontline person that's talking to them. And culture can be a lot of fun, and it can be really, really rewarding, and it just gets everyone on the same page.
Yeah, Jim, I mean, I love that, and I know you have a passion for it. I'll make it even simpler. You're either in a role where you deal with the customer directly, or you're in a role where you support the person who's dealing with the customer directly, right? Because I saw another question in here about how do I get others on board who aren't CX focused? And well, look, you're not in business without customers, right? I think Sam Walton had a quote about, the customer is the boss and they decide with their wallet. And the reality is everybody in your organization has something to do with the customer. You're either serving the customer or you're serving the people or in support of the people that are serving the customer. So, even for those people that say, hey, this isn't me, I work deep in the bowels of IT or, wherever it might be, show them the link that their role has and their job has to the customer. Because without their role, a system goes down, or somebody can't do their job as a result of this. The JFK NASA story always sticks with me there, if you've ever heard that one, right? John F. Kennedy went down to NASA after he said, hey, we're going to make it to the moon, and met the janitor and said, hey, what do you do here? And he said, my job is to keep the facility clean so that we can get people to the moon. Right? And this is the janitor, right, who presumably you would say ordinarily wouldn't think that he has a CX focus. No, he took this to heart and said, my job is to keep this place clean and safe so that the people who are trying to get people to the moon can do their job.
Excellent. Well, we promised people 5 minutes back. We have a few questions that we did not get to, but we will absolutely respond back to you. Eric, is there any parting shot we want to make before we wrap up?
No, hopefully this has been helpful for people. If I think back to that first poll where people said, hey, honestly, we're struggling with this. Hopefully we've given you some things to chew on. Hopefully we've given you some thoughts on how to break this down into smaller pieces so that you're not boiling the ocean, and you can, as Jim says, keep getting singles and walks and getting on base. Obviously we're here and we'd love to continue the conversation with you. So also, please reach back out through the InMoment channels, and we're happy to continue the dialogue.
Awesome. With that, we will wrap up. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. And we know that everyone's schedules are always tight. We appreciate the engagement. Hopefully the polls were fun, and hopefully you took away some tools. So have a great afternoon.